I have been waiting a long time to talk to you. We never talked. Eric Vento, I got you finally booked on
I
the
know,
show,
man.
and I'm
It
super
only took
excited to talk
52
to you.
videos.
That's okay. You're going to be lucky number 50, whatever. I don't even know. I
Yeah.
lost track. It doesn't matter. But what does matter is that you are probably one of the most impactful people in a positive way that I see on LinkedIn, and I'm honored to talk with you about this stuff that we're going to talk about. And but I want you to know how much I appreciate everything that you're doing every day out there on social media, trying to help our brothers and sisters in blue transition successfully like you have, and you continue to transition and you continue to move forward. And but needless to say, and to jump right into it, this has not been a seamless transition for you. It's not been easy for you or for me. We were just talking before we started recording about some of the things that we've been through, and let's talk about the mental health aspects of transition. There are things that people will experience, they're going through in their law enforcement career or their public safety career that will affect them in their transition. And we've got a few ideas on what those things are, but I want you to start off. Tell us what happens pre-transition when you're thinking about how you're going to be making that next move into the private sector. What was going on in your brain and in your experience that you want to share some lessons learned?
Yeah, definitely. So when I think about that question, I really think about it from two different perspectives. I think about it from the perspective of the involuntary transition out of law enforcement and the feelings and everything that are coming into play there, and the feelings of I'm not enough, and I'm leaving my dream job, I'm leaving my community, I'm leaving my family. I don't want to leave my family. I feel left out. I'm not on these group chats anymore. I'm not on these Facebook groups anymore. I just don't have that common connection. What the hell am I going to do? And then I think about it from the perspective of a voluntary transition out of law enforcement. Just because it's voluntary doesn't mean you still don't experience those exact same emotions. Now, maybe you don't experience it to the level of an involuntary, but it's still significant emotion. You're still leaving a home, you're still leaving a community, a culture, a language, and just because you may be ready to transition while you're in law enforcement, once you get out of law enforcement, you may realize that, man, I really wish I would have made a different decision, or this was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. I really miss A, B, C, and D. So whether it's involuntary or voluntary, there's a level of significant anxiety and a level of emotion that everyone goes through, and depending on your circumstances and how you handle it, that can really determine your mental health from that point on. Obviously, if you're dealing with a lot of mental health issues before that, then it's just going to build on top of each other, But how you exit law enforcement and how you transition to the corporate sector makes a big difference. And how you think about things and what your perspective is and what kind of attitude you have about transitioning to a completely new environment. So speaking for myself, everyone knows that my story is mostly involuntary. And, I had to be dragged kicking and screaming through the corporate sector. But it was only because I knew I didn't have a future in law enforcement anymore. And it took me a long time to realize that. I knew that the first day, but to have it sink in, to have it, okay, this is real. And I need to, for the sake of my family, I need to hurry up and get to the next stage. I need to make that mental transition. That took a lot longer, and being in that position of, I remember the day that I resigned in lieu of termination from the Houston Police Department. I walked out the front doors of headquarters in downtown Houston, and my sergeant walked out with me. I'd known him since the beginning, and he just put his arms around me and he hugged me, and he said, "I'm sorry," and at that point, I was in shock, and I didn't know. I wasn't aware of what was going on, and I walked down the sidewalk to my car. I got in, had some paperwork with me, no badge, no ID. Knew that I was getting some money from PTO and stuff like that, but for all intents and purposes, I didn't have anything else. And I had a couple thoughts flash across my mind. I thought, how am I going to tell my wife? How am I going to tell her that this happened? How am I going to tell her that it was my fault? How am I going to tell her this when I'm the breadwinner? I bring in the money and stuff like that. And the second thought I had was, you know, I was crushed, and I started crying in my car, because I saw my dream just literally evaporating in a thin air, and I knew how difficult it was going to be to get a second chance to go back into law enforcement if I ever did. And, um, so again, that was just the first day. But from that experience, my mental health took a decline after that for a couple of years, and significant anxiety, significant nightmares, flashbacks to certain events um, that caused me anxiety, or that were integral to my departure from law enforcement. Um, Internal affairs complaints, conversations with people, both unofficial and unofficial, incidents that occurred, and then obviously the other regular stuff in law enforcement that we never talk about that was still impacting me. So all of that combined on top of each other, I crashed for a couple of years, and went through some significant depression and some significant counseling. And to this day, I still have, I would say, a significant problem with anxiety, on a day-to-day basis. And my triggers are usually directly related to certain incidents that I went through in law enforcement. So like, for example, I'll give you one, and I've never talked about this before, but I figured it's time. Most of the time where I had an internal affairs complaint, or where I had something negative happen in my last year in law enforcement, was during a one-on-one with my supervisor. And everything was good up to that point. Every time I had a one-on-one, which were obviously regular, I had no idea that something negative was going to happen. But every single time over the course of a year when I had a one-on-one, I either got served with a complaint, or I had something negative told to me by a supervisor. And so now, in the corporate sector, every single time I have a one-on-one with a supervisor, whether I know in the back of my mind or not that, hey, everything's fine, you have done nothing wrong, this is just like a regular thing, this is part of management, this is part of leadership, I know all that stuff. But to my mind, it doesn't matter. I still get anxious. I start, in some cases, I start sweating. I start, having a fast heartbeat, and I start dreading that one-on-one. And, that's just one trigger that I have from my law enforcement days that has kind of transitioned into the corporate sector with me, and it's a constant thing that I deal with. It's a constant trigger that I deal with, but it's something that I'm actively working on, and I'm aware of it, and I recognize it. And so when it comes upon me, there's certain things that I do to I'm never going to negate it fully, not for a while at least, but there are things that I can do to lessen the effects, and again, it took me a long time to even get to that point, so yeah, I know everyone's different. Everyone has different experiences, and everyone's experience is unique. And there may be certain similarities with different experiences, of course, but every single experience is unique, and it's unique to the individual, and everyone's journey is different. Everyone's treatment path is different, if applicable. And, it's taken me a long time to get to the point where I can talk about it openly. Because to talk about it openly not only invites scrutiny and invites judgment, but it could also affect my career in some way, shape, or form, and obviously it would never be official, But I could easily have a hiring manager or someone look at my LinkedIn profile in the next couple of years and see these videos and say, I just don't know if I want to deal with that. You know, to which I would say, I think I'm a far better leader and contributor to the team with my experience, with my perspective, with what this trauma has caused than I was without it. You know, there are many days where I see a patrol car pass me or something like that, and I think, I wouldn't mind going back. You know, and it's not because I necessarily miss the high speed stuff. Of course, you know, that's fun, but I wish I could go back sometimes with the perspective that I have now. I wish I could go back with the vulnerability that I have, the empathy that my journey has led me to, and I think about how differently I would treat things, how differently I would treat people, how differently I would respond to calls, and treat people who are less, and who don't have much, and who are, there's so many different scenarios, but since that is no longer an option, and since I would probably be divorced if that ever happened again, um, I resolve to embrace my story. I resolve to embrace the trauma and the lessons learned, and to treat everyone, both personally and professionally, each and every day with that new mindset in mind. And whereas before I would get really frustrated with something, or I wouldn't give people a break, or I didn't have time for certain things, now I make time. Now I put myself on their level more and more and say, okay, I don't understand the situation, but I understand why you're feeling that way. And how can we get you to this place? How can we make this situation better? And I remember as a 22-year-old in law enforcement, that wasn't really top of my priority list. You know, and again, perspective is what you make of it. But now it is, and now I have a chance to, as a people manager, as an individual contributor, it doesn't matter. I have a chance to directly influence people's lives through my own perspective. And that's really what I live for each and every day.
And I realize, first of all, thank you for sharing that. I know how difficult that can be, having experienced a lot of this or some of the same things. We carry this stuff with us. It's not like, oh, you take off the uniform, you take off the badge, take off the gun, and you're good. I'm a civilian now.
Right.
Adam Willis talked about in a recent call that we had a couple weeks ago that he took off his gun after he worked for the sheriff, and the sheriff didn't get reelected, so you know what happens. He said he took off his gun, and he's a real Pro A guy, a Pro 2A guy, and CCW guy. And he said he put it in the safe, and he didn't touch it for a year because the memories are there. And
Mm-hmm.
everywhere you look, you have memories all behind me. And
Yeah.
I'm fortunate enough that most of those are good memories. But there are things that happen, these triggering events. The fact that you're aware that 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 there are things that will make you more anxious, or things that will bring back those memories. I think that's we're again not going to be healed overnight. This is going to take decades. It took decades to heap it on you. It's going to take
Right.
decades to smooth it out, or to you're never going to get over it. But for you to figure out how to deal with it better. I had kind of a similar thing happen actually today. I was texting, or a friend of mine texted me this evening because he's going for a job interview, and we had worked together on the job. And one of the last things that we worked together on was an officer involved homicide, and so he had mentioned that in his text, and that brought back the flood of memories of what happened that night, because I was the first agent on scene, and having to deal with it and quarterback this incident by myself for many hours. And I just sat here, and I just kind of let that wash over me, and I gave it some time, and then I went back to doing what I was doing. And again, it's not better, but we all have a way I describe it is that we all have a cup that's a certain size. Some are bigger, some are smaller, and that cup is uh, when it gets filled to the rim, that's all you can take. And sometimes it spills over, sometimes it cracks and breaks, but um, everybody has one, and we all deal with it a little bit differently. And I think just being aware that you have these problems, you have these struggles, that this has made you who you are, who we are,
Right.
and so I think that's your story is incredibly powerful. How much did you're not a young guy by any stretch of the imagination, but you're also not in your 60s,
Right.
coming out of law enforcement. How much did your kind of youth and your ability to pivot and have some runway play in your kind of your mindset? Was that part of that at all, or
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely part of it, but I would say um, it was going in the wrong direction. And what I mean by that is this: law enforcement was so deeply ingrained in who I was as a person that it was my complete identity.
yeah?
Like even when I went home to my wife, and I was newly married, you'd think I would have other things in my mind, and I was still like, seeing if what got this guy's bond was, and talking with the DEA, and writing a search warrant and stuff like that. It was just like 100% a part of me. I didn't know any different, and I wanted to be a cop since age 6. There was nothing else I wanted to do my entire life, all the way through college, was set on that goal line of, okay, academy, police officer, etc. And um, it was all I knew. And so after I resigned in lieu of termination from HPD, I was a glutton for punishment, and there's nothing else I wanted to do more than go back, and so I worked for a small department outside of Houston, and I had a use of force incident that I was exonerated on, but due to the politics and the news coverage, I was ultimately terminated for. And that was just like you know a kick to the face. I couldn't come up with a better example than that. But after what had happened with HPD and that happening within 3 months, it was just um, everything just cascaded over and over and over again. And
When you're
um,
reliving your experience
yeah,
with HPD?
exactly. Yeah, and to have a similar thing happen at another department, and of course, everything. There's a lot of family stuff going on as well that's contributing to it. But I thought, okay, I have to do something different for a while, and so I went up and I worked for a major financial services organization for about a year until I got my discharge overturned. And even when I was working for them, I was just thinking, how can I get back to law enforcement? Such was my passion, such was my desire, such was the emotions that were running through me. And at at the end of my experience with Capital One, I was offered a chance to go back to law enforcement in a state capacity here in Austin, and that experience was a nightmare. You know, um, I was told after I'd already moved here and accepted the job offer, I was told that no one wanted me to succeed, and that they were just they felt compelled to give me an opportunity. And so before I even started, I was already doubting myself, and I was doubting whether this organization even wanted to give me a chance. And from that moment on, I walked on eggshells every single day. And I was called out constantly for minor things. And, um, it ultimately ended with me being terminated again. And with no warning, nothing whatsoever, just, here one day and gone the next. And that was the final straw for me emotionally. I had put my family through hell for 3 years, moves, financial issues, mental health issues, and a host of other things that were contributing to mental aspect of it. But that final straw just it pushed me over the edge mentally. And um, I looked in the mirror, that day, and I said, I'm done. I'm not doing this to myself anymore. I'm not doing this to my family anymore. And, I just said, okay, Lord, I surrender. I'm, you know, push me in the direction that you want me to go. And, that was even after three different agencies in a row where I had a significantly negative experience. Um, I still love law enforcement. Most of my friends are still in law enforcement, but I draw the line, and like I get texts all the time, hey bro, want to see what I got tonight? I'm like, no, don't care.
Yeah.
Are you okay? Are you safe? Yes. Okay.
Right.
Otherwise, I don't care. Don't tell me about it. I don't want to know. Just because I have drawn a line in the sand for myself as it pertains to law enforcement. I already struggle enough with the mental side effects and the nightmares and the triggering events. Um, I don't need additional fodder for that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, I know that was a kind of a long response, but yeah, I mean, that experience though, going through that on multiple occasions has caused me to be able to pivot much more, I would say, fluidly and dynamically now because I've been through it. Yeah, I've been through it at three different agencies. I've been through the termination process. I've been through the financial loss. I've been through everything that comes from losing your job. And it's allowed me to pivot in a very fluid and dynamic way to other things that come across my path. And again, the mindset is so huge. And it's not something that just happens overnight. It takes a while for you to mentally make that switch. And even people who are like, hey, 30 years out, I'm ready to retire, I'm ready to get out. That's fine. But once you do get out, once you make your last call over the radio, and once you turn in your ID, once you sign your paperwork down at the pension office, whatever it is, you will still feel something. You will still have emotion coursing through you. Maybe not then, but maybe a couple of days later when you're sitting around, you're like, man, okay, what do I do now? Like, I missed this, I missed that. And, I hear from people all the time who are like, I thought I was ready. I really thought I was ready. I went through A, B, C, and D, and I got to the other side and I realized I just didn't prepare myself, mentally for the transition. Physically, I was ready, but mentally, I was not. And I think that's so much the issue nowadays is whether it's voluntary or involuntary, it's a mindset switch. And for so long, I struggled with regret. I regretted all these different things that led me to the decisions that I made, the decisions that led to all these different circumstances in my life, and regret really ruled me. And eventually I learned to use regret as the fire to make different decisions and to do better. You know, um, Silent wounds, is what they call mental health trauma. And there's I was listening to a podcast the other day that was given by Matt Domyancic. I'd probably butcher it, but I'm just going to spell it out. He's a former SWAT team member in Northern Virginia. He now counsels first responders on mental health and wellness. And he does a podcast called The Leaderist on listennotes.com. And he said, and it was quoted in a CNN article, and he said, if you don't heal what hurts you, you'll bleed on the people who didn't cut you. And I really identify with that because, you know, um, I pushed a lot of people away. I I hurt my family. I hurt my wife. I hurt my friends throughout all these different episodes, and it almost caused me to get divorced. You know, and like I said, I because I didn't take it seriously, or I did take it seriously, but because I didn't know how to handle it, because I didn't know how to address it or how to heal from it, it just stays with you, and eventually it just builds and builds until it crests like a tidal wave. And you know that's probably a story for another time. But how you ride that wave down determines where you go from there. And for me, it was years and years of counseling and medication and talking with people who had been there before and who had found their way out of the darkness, and who didn't mind talking about it. That's what's kind of led me here is, I have people message me and call me every day now. Probably get like 45 to 50 phone calls or messages every day from people who are either in similar situations or looking for a way out. And they're saying, hey, I didn't think anyone understood until I saw your podcast, or I didn't think that there was hope until I saw this or I saw that. And, what I say to those people is there is hope and there is help. And there are people who have been in your shoes. There are people who have walked where you have walked. And no one is ever going to say that their experience was exactly the similar to yours, because they're not. We're all unique. But the emotions that we feel, the mental feelings that we have, those are similar, and the vulnerability and the empathy and the regret and the guilt and the anger and the sense of loss, all of those feelings are similar. And we all go through them to varying degrees depending on our circumstances, and
And
eventually,
I would say it's okay to go through those too.
yeah,
Nothing wrong with that. That's human.
right,
It means you're alive
right,
and you're feeling it. And I love this that what you're sharing is we're not the first people to go through it, and we're not going to be the last people to go through it.
right,
We're all going through this together. It may be we're processing it differently,
yeah,
but sharing these stories, there's nothing wrong with that. And we need to remove the stigma of mental health on law
right,
enforcement. That because there's all kinds of problems in law enforcement. If you have to go into counseling, you could have your gun removed depending on what your agency policy is, right? You could be removed from active status. So that mental health stigmatism carries with you, and maybe even into the private sector a little bit. Have
yeah.
you experienced that in the private sector where people are like, oh, well, you were in law enforcement. That must have been really hard. You must have a lot of issues. Are you hearing that
Oh
at all?
yeah. I mean, my first foray into the corporate sector was at Capital One,
Mm.
and to go from law enforcement to an organization where I was working or managing 22-year-olds who were straight out of college, who, you know, depending on their life, they didn't have a whole lot of life experience. You know, they just didn't understand. And they didn't, when they heard I was in law enforcement, the first thought they had that crossed through their brains was, oh man, have you ever been in a high speed chase? Have you ever watched Cops? Have
Hmm.
you ever been on Cops? If I go back to episode 23 on season 6, will I see your name? And it's really hard to build a sense of camaraderie and a sense of healing when all everyone wants to do is talk about your past experience, and um, but that's normal, and I had to get used to that. And there were certain steps that I could take to, hey guys, I just don't want to talk about that, or hey, let's talk about your life. How was college? Let's like divert, change the subject, etc. But that was hard for me, and it definitely didn't make the mental transition easier. But at the same time, not being in that law enforcement environment, not being surrounded by that culture and that language and everything that goes on within a police department, that was healing to me.
Yeah.
To go somewhere where people weren't judging me for my past, weren't judging me for my present, to go somewhere where people didn't know me, and where they only cared about my productivity for that day and not my productivity 5 years ago. That was, for me, that was mentally freeing,
Mm.
and I used that as part of the healing process.
Do you feel like you have evolved from your time in law enforcement? And that's a weird question, I understand, but like, I'm trying to understand is how have you changed over that time? Because these experiences are what make us, right? And how is that these experiences in your past and your experiences in your that you're experiencing now? How is that changing you? Or how is that evolving you?
Yeah. One of the first things I was told in counseling several years ago, and um, they were like, "Hey, this is what needs to happen, but it probably won't happen for you for a long time. I just want you to know that ahead of time." And I was just like, well, whatever. It can't be worse than what I just went through. So lay it on me. And they said, first, you need to forgive self. Forgive yourself for the mistakes that you've made and the regret and the guilt that you hold within yourself. And then you need to forgive the people who have wronged you. You need to forgive the people that you have perceived to have
Perceived,
wronged
yeah.
you during all these different incidents. And that took me years. It took me years for the second one, but it took me probably 4 to 5 years for me to finally say to myself, Eric, I forgive you. And I will no longer live in guilt. I will no longer live in shame. I will no longer live with regret because it is tearing myself apart.
Is that something you
And
constantly hammer on when it comes up? A negative thought bursts into your brain, and it could be you're watching TV, you're in something a little bit stressful, and it comes into your brain. What's that? How do you attack that, or do you attack it? How
yeah,
do
yeah.
you
I mean,
you remove
I
that?
because I've dealt with it for so many years, I know exactly what the trigger is going to cause and what the after effects will be, whether it's my attitude with my wife, whether it's a headache, whether there's all these different circumstances that come into play. And, I'm not perfect and I don't respond the best way that I can every single time. But what I try to do more often than not is say, okay, I recognize that I'm getting anxious or I'm getting pissed or I'm getting angry because of A, B, C, and D, that, this show reminded me of this, or, this conversation reminded me of that, but that's in the past. And I am a new person. I've gone through a lot, but I've come out on the other side. And I
Yeah.
can choose to let this impact me in a negative way, or I can choose to, you know, move on. And again, I don't always make the best choice and stuff like that, but that's the question that comes into my brain every single time because by now I know exactly what my triggers are and I know exactly what my body and my emotional response will be. And I don't want to let that have control over me anymore. I went through years of letting it rule my life, and I'm a different person now. And to your question about the evolution process, you know, um, what I've learned from the past several years. I mean, I could write a book on probably, but the top things that I've learned that I keep coming back to and that I talk about with others who are going through similar situations is I talk about the power of forgiveness. Not again, forgiving others is good and that definitely helps, but so often we forget to forgive ourselves for our wrongs and our perceived actions that caused outcome A, B, C, and D. And that can be a lot of the reason we hold stuff in and we constantly relive things over and over and over again, either consciously or subconsciously. And um, after I literally forgave myself, my nightmares lessened, and some of my anxiety producing events lessened. Because and again, whatever works. If it's saying it out loud, if it's saying it to someone else, if it's writing a letter to yourself saying, self, this occurred, this impacted me in this way, I forgive you. If it's writing a letter to someone who wronged you in the past, like whether it goes to them or not, just the fact of writing it down can be a substantial help to our mental health. And as I stated in the beginning, probably the biggest thing that I consistently come back to is, you know, the vulnerability and the empathy. that I have now. Um,
Yeah.
like I was very much hey, my problems are my own, and I don't care about anyone else's when I was in law enforcement. I was very cynical, and I carried that over into the corporate sector for a couple of years, and other people's problems, they didn't matter. And now, with everything that I've gone through and the counseling and everything, I'm able to not only pivot, as you mentioned earlier, much more dynamically to certain events, but I'm able to meet people where they are on a much more deeper foundational level, either as a people manager or just as a friend, as a colleague, as a coworker. To have empathy for what people are going through, even if it doesn't affect me. To be able to say, I hear you, I understand, how can I help? And actually mean it, and not just be giving them lip service. And that's I think that's the biggest thing for me is having that empathy and having that vulnerability to talk about it with people because you know what I've learned over the past couple of years of talking about it is there is such a need in our world, in our society, for people to talk about mental health, specifically as it pertains to law enforcement and the military. Obviously, everyone, and there's mental health everywhere, but since we both come from a law enforcement and a military background, we have that specific knowledge and that specific scarring, if you will.
Yeah.
And, it's a gift to be able to talk about it. It's a gift to be able to talk about it candidly and openly. And, as we discussed prior to the recording, it's healing. It's healing for me. It's healing for others. And I'm really blessed that I'm in a place where I'm able to discuss it so candidly and so openly without fear of, additional triggering events or additional retaliation. And just let it be a part of my story, but not what defines me.
Which is a great place to probably pause because I think what we're talking about is figuring out what's going on before you start that transition process.
Right.
And I'm not saying you got to have it solved before you leave your law enforcement
Right.
organization, but I think being aware of the challenges and putting support around those are really the positive things that you're talking about. But let's talk in the next segment about what that looks like during transition and what that looks like post transition. Because I know that you're helping and you're speaking to a lot of people here that are going through the same thing. So I really appreciate you sharing, Eric, these great experiences. And great not as in good, but great as in oh my gosh, they're huge. And I know you're helping people out there. And what I say to people, like what I always say is, don't go it alone. You're not alone. There are folks like Eric and I who are here to help you. Leave a comment down below. Share this with your partners, and let's keep this conversation going.
Yep.
And we'll be back here in just a second.
Thanks, Scott.